All right, what's going on, fellas? Continuing with the every Sunday on the Sunday promise. We've got 30 minutes on the clock for me to answer your guys' training related questions. Hopefully help you guys with your efforts to get big and strong. Usually just throw up a community post a couple of days before I do these. I put one up on Friday. You guys gave me your questions. I will do so again probably next Friday. So if you've got a question that you want answered, you can probably get it in on there. If it's hyper specific to you, we might skip over it. If it's injury related, we might skip over it. I do have a Patreon in the YouTube description, and I try to get back to everybody on there within 48 hours, usually 24. Kind of consult people, help them out with their training. So if you got some really specific questions, you're more than welcome to ask me them on there. I think it's just $5. I feel like that's pretty reasonable. If you don't feel that reasonable, don't go on there. But also, if you just have something, it's not necessarily a question you even care about. You think it would be an interesting discussion and you want to hear my thoughts, you can also throw them in these question things. And if it's a fun training topic, I'm sure I can riff on it and ramble about it forever. So we're going to talk some training. Coach Klong is behind the camera today because she's having a bad hair day. So she's going to be asking the questions instead of answering them today. So timer starts now. What is the first question?
Do you think it's more important to build a muscle base or a technique base as a beginner?
Like I talked about in that last video, I like doing those things side by side. There are more Eastern European systems more heavily influenced by weightlifting that lean more into the, hey, let's get very, very proficient technique, and then just a progressive overload will almost apply itself if we can get very technical. The problem is that doesn't always work. And you can see this with some people that are probably a little too far down like the squat U rabbit hole of they need to make their 2-plate squat even prettier before they even consider adding weight, and their left toe and their toes aren't spread, and they've got this endless list of things that stop them from applying effort, right? So that's kind of where the way I do it is you can emphasize it one way or the other. There's some guys that get stronger earlier and then get more technical as they go, and some guys get a little bit more technical earlier and then get stronger as they go, and they seem to produce pretty good results. It only is really a deficiency when we go too far to either end of that spectrum, right? We have the guy who's going crazy trying to make sure his 2-plate squat is the most beautiful thing ever, but at the end of the day, no disrespect to the guy, he's training like a bit of a bitch and he's just not trying hard. And his results are very lackluster. And while he can flex on the internet how great his 2-plate squat form is, if he's a power lifter, you don't get bonus points for how pretty it is. So it's like that might be too far, where we're focusing so much on technique that we're taking away from applying the requisite intensity to get better. Other end of the spectrum, I'm sure a lot of us that like my channel have gone down this route, apply a shit ton of intensity without enough emphasis on technique, and that intensity might lead you towards an injury. That intensity might lead you towards a really rough, that might make you really good, really quick, and then you hit the hardest plateau of your life because now you got to learn how to deadlift. You know what I mean? I definitely have been there myself. So I would say as long as we're somewhere in the middle and our strength and our technique are aiming for proportionate to one another, like advanced, beginner, I would say we are probably in a good spot. That being said, getting our technique good early, if that doesn't take away from our efforts, is always a good idea. It's going to be worth its weight in gold, and it's going to really smooth out our progression as we apply that intensity and that aggression. If we've got our form really pretty dialed into mechanically efficient early, it's a lot smoother sailing than the guy who has to constantly, okay, I just hit the absolute upper limits of this kind of shoddy technique. I need to reinvent myself. But that being said, either direction can be a deficiency if taken too far. Question 2, go.
Thoughts on push pressing as an exercise for both strength and hypertrophy? This person is a weightlifter, and they have been interested in experimenting with the push press for big delts.
So as far as strength for weightlifting, I think they're awesome. I would almost favor towards a push press over a strict press, right? We've got this idea of rising specificity across someone's career. Earlier in their career, I think strict pressing definitely has a place for a weightlifter, just developing some general physicality, putting muscle around the shoulder girdle is a good idea. But as we get stronger and stronger, you'll see a lot of the best weightlifters, almost all of them, are not putting a ton of weight behind having the biggest strict press possible. It's probably just too far away from the physical qualities that are going to correlate with the biggest jerk possible. Whereas a push press is one deviation more specific. So strength in that movement probably is going to correlate very well with strengths on your jerk. That being said, there probably is a time and a place to work on our strict Olympic style overhead. Olympic style, not meaning back when it was the clean and the press where we lay back like a mile. We're talking about the overhead press where we are remaining very upright, driving the head through very early to closer mirror the positions we are looking for in a push press or a jerk. So it's not necessarily the best way to overhead press the most weight possible. It's the way to overhead press to have it actually be at least somewhat relevant to how we're doing our overheads with leg drive. So as far as strength goes for your goals, A+, awesome. As far as hypertrophy, it probably leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of it's probably not going to be as good as a strict movement, right? We've got this idea of stretch median hypertrophy, the longer muscle lengths, loading those is probably more stimulative to hypertrophy than the shorter muscle lengths, and we're assisting that bottom range with the legs, yada, yada, yada. But that being said, just because something is a step away from optimal does not mean it's not effective. I've done training cycles of push press, and I feel it has absolutely put size onto my shoulders. The question is more about your goals. What is your biggest priority? If you are truly a weightlifter, I would probably be doing more overhead with leg drive than I would be doing overhead strict, even if that is a step away from what might be best suited for pure hypertrophy goals. Maybe if we're talking purely bodybuilding, we would not want to be standing. We wouldn't want our balance to come into play. We wouldn't want our bracing to come into play. We would want to create this environment of stability where we're seated, so that way the muscle fibers of our delts are a lot more likely to be the pure limiting factor rather than something else, right? So if the goal is pure hypertrophy, we're probably looking at a strict press. We're probably looking at seated. We might be looking at a machine that lets us get this nice range of motion without our head getting in the way. But that being said, just because something isn't this hypothetical optimal, it can still be extremely effective training. And if your goal is a blend of strength and size, right? Now those two things have a lot of overlap. I think you can absolutely justify using push pressing in your program.
If you had to get the biggest, strongest, lower and mid traps possible, what would be your go-to exercises?
Oh gosh. That's probably, I probably would like to, I guess it's function specific, right? So it's like, if we are talking the biggest, I would say, honestly, just a variety of rowing movements are probably going to develop them to a reasonable degree. But if we're talking about like the function of the lower traps in terms of them being a major player in overhead stability, overhead positioning, I really like IYT raises. IYT raises are my jam. I definitely find that they have developed some position-specific strength in my lower traps that's really improved the quality of my overhead presses. Trap 3 raises is a little bit lower scale, maybe debatably like usually used in a rehab setting, but they can be scaled up a little bit and used for strength training. But I like the IYTs more. Depending on how you execute your face pulls, potentially we could again be hitting a little bit more of that lower trap area. Am I missing any? I would say number one would just be IYT raises done on a frequent basis on top of bigger compounds that are going to be more holistic back movements, right? Those are more of a topping off the larger scale training. Those would be my pick.
All right. What is your opinion on pec flies, or it says press flies for pec hypertrophy, going from pronated to neutral grip? The argument is that the pronated grip at the bottom to neutral grip at the top is that shoulder flexion combined with shoulder reduction makes more holistic pec movement, just like how you do dumbbell curls from neutral to supinated grip to train both functions of the bicep.
I would say the rotation of the dumbbells from neutral at the top to pronated at the bottom, that probably is just adding a level of needless complexity that's going to take away from your focus on probably areas of greater importance. Just because I think that's a pretty frequent thing you can see in the world today is people are looking more into biomechanics and optimization of movements. But if something is going to take a reasonable amount of focus and is going to yield relatively minor returns, as I would probably contest the rotation that dumbbell would, I don't think that's adding much. If that's your preference, if it feels more comfortable to do it with that bit of rotation, go for it. I'm a big fan of fly presses in general. Fly presses being kind of the halfway point between a dumbbell bench press and a pec fly. For those of you who aren't familiar, you're coming down to a little bit more bend in the arm. You're coming up to a squeeze position rather than a pure locked arm angle where we're coming way out to the side like we might on a pec fly. It's somewhere in between. I think a lot of people would argue the way I do my cable pec flies in my program right now is bordering on a fly press, and I've gotten the best results from those. So I like them as a supplemental movement for driving up our bench press, which is I know the guy who commented this. He's a very good bench presser. I'm guessing he means pec hypertrophy relevant to the bench press. I would probably just say whatever hand position leads to the most comfort. We want to focus on standardizing our reps, really squeezing the upper back musculature at the bottom of that fly, trying to open at the pec fibers rather than open at the shoulder. Those of you who know a lot of flies, you might know that feeling of if you go past a certain point, we're really starting to open at the front of the shoulder rather than open at the pec fibers. I usually stop as low as I can go, opening at the pec, squeeze that kind of rhomboid rear trap area so I'm really pulling myself into it, and I will always pause. Those come back up, maybe a little squeeze. I would argue that the bottom is more important. So if the goal of you doing these is pec hypertrophy relevant to the bench press, I would probably just focus on, okay, hey, let's nail those mechanics. Whatever hand position feels comfortable is going to be secondary. I probably wouldn't major in the minors chasing like this hypothetical pec optimization thing, especially given that we're presumably not bodybuilding. You might be bodybuilding. I don't know. But yeah, those would be my thoughts.
All right, the next guy says that he has a previous low back injury and he can't really back squat, but he can front squats. So he was wondering what your thoughts were on sticking to front squats as a main squatting movement. He also says he has no powerlifting aspirations.
Okay, yeah. So, the first thing that comes to mind is that's goal dependent, right? You got it out of the way. If your goal is to powerlift, no, that's not going to work. You need to find a way to rehab yourself into the position where you can back squat. Now, it's important to note our language we use around that kind of thing is probably quite important. You probably should phrase that, I cannot back squat right now. That doesn't mean forever you can't back squat. There's probably a route you could take of movement progressions and rehabilitation and building up position-specific tolerance and tissue tolerance. There's probably a hypothetical, like, all the possibilities lay out before me. There's a route you could take probably that would lead you back to back squatting. The question is it worth the trial and error and the amount of difficulty? For some people, that it's really not that far away, and they're just telling themselves because their doctor said they never squat again, that they can never squat again, when really it's like 2 turns away of reasonable rehab. For some people, that's a very snaking path, right?
He does say that he can back squat, but usually the session ends in pain.
Okay.
So.
Okay, but again, like we could say, okay, there is probably some phrasing there where you're like, I can't back squat without pain right now. Hypothetically, in the future, you could. Whether it's worth the trials and tribulations is kind of, I guess, more so what you're asking. And I guess, again, it depends on our goals, right? Okay, we're not going to power lift, so there's no concept of specificity dictating what we have to do. But I guess it still will come down to your goals. If your goals is maximizing leg size, more general athleticism, it's going to depend a little bit. But yeah, I think front squats, depending on how general our goals are, if we're just trying to gain the benefits of resistance training for our health and longevity, fuck yeah. Back squats don't make you live longer than front squats. Just do a heavy squat pattern, and we're going to derive all of these benefits in bone density and tendon density and ligament density and all of that good shit that comes along with weight training, potentially reduced blood pressure, all of these cool things. We're going to get those. So I guess it just comes down to what are you squatting for is going to dictate whether you need to maybe trial and error that long path of returning to back squats without pain, or, hey, that's not worth it. I'm just going to focus on getting good at front squats, and that totally is going to meet my goals. Why the hell would I do that?
How heavy do you think most variations should be taken during a strength phase? Is there value in trying to hit relatively heavy rep PRs on variations, or should they continue to be used to drive up volume like they would in a hypertrophy phase?
That's a very good question, right? It depends on the variation, right? And what we're trying to get out of the variation. If that variation is more hypertrophy oriented, let's say we're talking about a RDL, right? We go from a hypertrophy phase to a strength phase. We might even leave the loading of that RDL in hypertrophy ranges to continue running up volume, like you said, right? Because primarily what we're looking for is to hypertrophy the posterior chain there. If it's something a little bit closer, that's a little bit more of like a strength and a skill and a neural thing, like let's say a pause deadlift instead, absolutely, we're probably going to take those into strength relevant percentage range. We might even take those into peaking ranges. Now that percentage is going to be based off a max pause deadlift rather than that percentage being based off of your max deadlift, right? Because you probably might not be able to pause true peaking ranges on some variations, but it's relative to your max on that variation. But yeah, we might really take those into some heavy ranges. And because let's say the pause deadlift, we're trying to fight that weight pulling us forward and fight that weight pulling us out of position. And that can be done effectively in the 1 to 3 rep range even. So I think it comes down to what variation you're doing. So some might stay more hypertrophy oriented and then drop out of the program completely. They're never even taken to strength and peaking phases. Some might be taken from hypertrophy to strength and they kind of dropped out in the peaking phase to drop some fatigue. And some things you might feel, man, if I'm not doing pause deadlifts or if I'm not doing pause squats or if I'm not doing XYZ motion, I immediately notice it in my squat. Like if there's some motions, if they're really well selected, when you hit a certain position, you can tell whether you've been doing that motion or not. And those I might even keep in until we need to like decay or fatigue to test our max, right? They might stay in basically year round because we notice those positive effects. I can tell when I'm not doing those. And those might stay in all 3 ranges. You know, they might be trained for hypertrophy and they might be trained for strength and they might be trained for a peak because they're challenging very specific strengths and skills that are problems on your main lift. So getting better at those across these ranges is presumably going to make you better at your main task across these ranges.
Then somebody tacked onto this question asking if they care about like general strength but not 1RM performance, if it was worth peaking to a 1RM or if a 5RM or 3RM would be more beneficial.
I think both can work, right? There's some cool skill qualities that can be built off of singles that are helpful for general strength development, right? Just like how if your goal was a 5RM, we still would hit sets of 8, even though it's not the maximum specificity. You could argue that goes in the other direction, right? You could maybe make an argument if the goal is a 5RM, there might be phases where taking the rep lower, right? Towards a triple, towards a single. But that being said, I think there's nothing wrong with training for a progressive 3RM, right? Like maybe that's your metric, right? You're not necessarily concerned with what you can do for a single. Maybe you just don't like the risk to reward ratio, although I would contest the risk to reward ratio on a heavy triple would probably be pretty similar. But let's say that's how you break it down. I think you can get phenomenal results. I don't think you're going to see a massive difference between the two if your peaking phase ends in a triple rather than a single. It's just a little bit different. I will often do that on some motions I don't really care to take to one. I will usually set up, for example, my primary strict press in my training program right now is a strict behind the neck press, not dead stop to the traps, reverse kind of ear level-ish, because it's very easy to take those to a close proximity to failure without having any layback. I like them. They make my shoulders feel good. I don't really have any interest in taking away from the front, putting it behind my head, doing a single, and then putting it down. That just doesn't sound like very effective training. It's not something I compete in. I'm using that exercise not to be good at the exercise, but I'm using that exercise for the positive effect it has on my more strongman relevant movements. I train that up to a triple, 5 to 3. If I end with a good 5 to 3 rep PR at the end, that's my indication that I've had a successful training cycle. Just like if someone might hit a single at the end, and that's their indication. Okay, what I did earlier, this training cycle was effective. Let's run it back with increased numbers. Yeah, totally okay.
Yeah, he was also asking about the fatigue cost and lack of volume during the peaking phase, which I think is a fair question.
You can always supplement your volume as well. So like you can do I just call it a soft peak or a training peak, where we continue doing our kind of background bodybuilding work, where our top work looks like we're doing a competition style peak, where we're hitting like a top single and some like back off triples. Some pretty traditional peaking style work. We're working up towards like 90 to 95% on a single. We back off to like 85%, put in some down sets. That volume is coming really low on the main lift. But if someone is really just kind of chipping away and they just don't want to spend any time away from growing because they know that that's the biggest thing they really need to do is just continue putting on more muscle. They don't want doing a training peak to waste time away from putting in relevant hypertrophy work. We can say, okay, well, I know I won't express my peak quite as well as if I did like a comp style peak and we tapered off those accessories. We're just going to keep doing our bodybuilding work afterward. Yes, that's going to dampen the effectiveness of the peak, but that's why it's a training peak. It's not a competition peak. And I would generally recommend not doing a competition style peak. Like we can go heavy in training, but I wouldn't do a competition like taper and deload and peak unless we're competing for the most part, unless you set some goals for yourself and you really want to maximize your chances of getting them. then we can prepare like we would for a competition to maximize that result. But maximizing in training isn't as important as seeing continual forward progression, right? If you knew, well, if I deloaded, I could have done 10 more. Okay, cool, we know that. But let's focus on, even under that fatigued condition, just getting 5 to 10 pounds better each training cycle. We're succeeding. Now we just got to do that for a long time. And if we can do that repeatedly under a slightly fatigued state, cool. That means we don't have to back off our efforts to try to put on a little bit of muscle. So if you feel like the volume's tapering too low, you always have the option of keeping your supplemental and your hypertrophy work pretty present afterward. That's what I do a lot of the time.
Speaking of competitions, somebody asked when you and Max are competing next, and says, thanks for your lifting insight and upgrading your microphone.
I didn't even upgrade my microphone. I just don't know how to like set up the settings, but I've had it. I am doing a strongman contest with Kirst at some point in August at our gym here in town. Nothing too extravagant, not traveling to like a high level comp. Just getting more comp experience. I figured I would show face around here. It'd be weird to not do the contest at my own gym here in town. So me and Kirst are doing that together. Been training for that. We actually have to go do some bag toss after we finish this video because we didn't get that done yesterday before the gym closed. So we're going to do our bag toss practice today. And then Max's competition schedule is a little bit up in the air. He has a pro qualifier meet for the USAPL in Vegas, but he's dealing with a little bit of a back injury, and we're kind of playing that by ear. Thankfully, he lives with me, and we can get these rapid feedback and adjustments to the program to, as best we can, rehab and peak. More than likely, he'll be doing that. What kind of state he's in will kind of depend, and then he's going to turn around and do a local competition a little bit after, assuming he's probably not going to be in his greatest shape for that Vegas meet. But that's kind of the plans right now. Rehab's going really well. He's been progressing super quickly, back up to like 5 plates on the squat and the deadlift already. So we've almost got the green light to start pushing into some real difficult nitty-gritty training on the squat and the deadlift. He's been able to keep his strength up via the accessories that are a little bit more back sparing, like the leg press and the rows and such. So we know his holistic strength is pretty good, and he should retrain quite quickly. So I'm not worried about that at all yet.
Meta question for you, Sam.
Meta.
What do you think the next big weightlifting trend is going to be? Right now, I read the current trend as the optimal training bros. This exercise is, quote-unquote, scientifically proven to grow XYZ muscle. But in fact, we know that most of that is complete bullshit. A trend I see growing seed right now is the train hard group. With the recent growth of folks like GVS, Coach Butler, Bromley, and yourself, I see a lot more about putting more effort achieving greater results. Is this wishful thinking, perhaps? Maybe. Curious on your input.
I mean, I guess it just depends on what realm is the trend going to be in. Is it what, like, are we talking about what's the next trend in bodybuilding? Because I know for a little bit, everybody reverse banding the shit out of their hack squats so they could do 1,000,000 plates. At first, that was a good little idea of like, okay, well, maybe we could alter the strength curve and maybe spare our knees a little bit. And then people started kind of missing the forest for the trees and throwing a giant band on there, seemingly so they could just do a unbelievable number of plates, right? So it was taken a little bit too far. And in powerlifting, we've had trends of tempos and belt squats. And I guess it just depends on what little circle we're residing in. YouTube fitness seems to be kind of its own sphere. Like I noticed the trends in competitive powerlifting look a little bit different than the trends here on YouTube, where everybody was freaking out about pause sumos and belt squats in powerlifting. It seemed like over here everybody was going crazy about weighted dips and weighted chins, right? So where we are, the trends seem to be different. I've kind of got my finger on the pulse of some of those. You know, I kind of know a little bit of what's going on in like the tested bodybuilding side and the untested bodybuilding side, and a little bit of what's going on in the tested powerlifting scene. There's no communication between the tested powerlifting side and the untested. They're like completely different things. For those of you who aren't familiar, like they don't, for the most part, they don't even talk to each other. And I'm like got a little weird finger in both worlds where, you know, I'm an untested athlete and I kind of know my other untested athletes. I know a little bit's going on there. Max competes in the USAPL and he's more in that world. And so I get to see a lot of it going on. As far as what the trend will be, let's go off of what you said, which is kind of the optimal bros, the biomechanics crowd, this training optimization guys. You know, kind of the iliac pull down, TikTok type of dudes. The longer I've been around, the more I've realized the shit literally is just a pendulum that reactionary goes back too far in the other direction. So like, we'll be like, specificity is awesome. Specificity is going to give you overuse injuries. Specificity is awesome. Specificity is terrible. Use the novel stimulus effect, right? Volume, low volume. It just goes back and forth. It's a bit of a pain. And now that the internet's kind of separating into its own little niche communities, I guess some of them will stay consistent, but the like big what's trendy right now goes back and forth. So I bet you once we're done with this whole like training optimization thing, it's going to swing way back towards do the big compound basics. They're way better than we're going to go back in that direction. It seems like at some point, right? And it's like, as usual, the truth is probably using a bit of both and falling somewhere in the middle, right? You use some sets to failure and some submaximal sets. I don't know why people are so hell-bent on thinking you have to do all of your subsets with reps in reserve or all of them to failure when you can use some of both. As many smart bodybuilders have talked about. Kind of the same thing is like, okay, we don't have to do 1 set per week and we don't have to do 30 sets per week. We can probably do somewhere in the middle. I think the next pendulum will be like minimalist training and just do the big compounds and 1 to 2 motions per session or something. Like anti-isolation. I'm sure there's going to be a big wave of that. That would be my guess.
All right, how much in percentages are your recommendations for reduction in volume and intensity for a deload week, more specifically after a peaking block?
Okay, so after a peaking block is different. Okay, that's fair. I can't give you any specifics, right? Because the specifics are going to look very different from person to person. Like a bigger untested athlete is going to be able to accumulate this quantity of fatigue. They're probably also in worse shape as an untested super, which does not help, and that kind of adds more to it. Where it might take them like 2 weeks to decay their fatigue. If you've got a really in shape, natural, smaller weight class man or really in shape, smaller weight class woman, the absolute load's being lifted, they're fitter, they're going to decay their fatigue quicker. So like the protocols for what constitutes a deload, it's really annoying that people are like, if it's not a 50% reduction in volume and intensity, you're not going to deload shit. Dude, there are beginners that are benching 45 pounds. It's going to take them a whole week of cutting everything in half. They can't cut their bench in half. What are you going to do? Saw the bar in half? Like, these like really dogmatic, like what needs to happen for a deload. Almost none of the people I follow that are smart swear by these things. It's people that fall below that are like really dogmatic about it. It depends on the athlete. Now, a different coach will have different preferences for what they start people out with. Observe, kind of tailor from there. But generally speaking, after a peaking phase, I usually like to just have someone get into the idea of, okay, we're going to spend a week or two building up your work capacity to the point where you're going to be capable of doing effective hypertrophy training. And usually leaning into that of doing, okay, we're going to do a little bit more like maybe cardio to start the session or after the session. We're going to limit our rest intervals for a little bit higher reps on the squats. Something like that will usually be enough to decay the because we're working on this totally different physical quality of our work capacity. I'm sorry, I don't have specifics for you and exactly how to do that, because like how we might deload, okay, we reach our peak of our prep, we hit like, let's say some pretty heavy numbers in this fatigued state. So it's like if an athlete is working up towards a peak, they're getting ready for a powerlifting meet, if they can move 95% and it looks pretty decent under these peak fatigued conditions, because some coaches, what they'll do is they'll deload repeatedly through the prep, right? So they'll deload, hit a big number, deload, hit a big number, deload, hit a big number, deload, do the meet, right? And so looking at exactly how those prior heavy lifts moved is going to be directly informative of how the meet is going to go, because they were under similar scenarios to the meet. How Kirsten and I do it, for example, is a little bit more like, okay, if we can move, we're going to be under fatigued conditions. There are a lot of lifters that do this, and people be like, oh my God, his peak made him so much stronger. It wasn't that his peak made him stronger, it's that the fatigue was making him weaker. And the fact that he was able to move 90 to 95%, looking even acceptable under that fatigued of a condition, we decay that fatigue, they were actually that strong all along, right? And that's a big fundamental misunderstanding. Like pre-meet deload, I could probably lay out at some point in the video, just like what a really generic week might look like. But as far as post-meet, some people are out of the gym for a week, and that's how they decay their fatigue. Some people just go hiking that week. Some people get in the gym and they say, no barbells, just do bodybuilding work. And that's kind of an old school one, no barbells the week after the meet. I always heard the guys tell me that, and I would always ignore them and go right back in and start squatting and benching and deadlifting that like Monday after the meet. That's what I always did. But there's a whole lot of different ways to do it. The no barbell, come in and get a pump, have some fun, do some bodybuilding sessions. That could be a great way to decay the fatigue after the peak. Or we can drop our loads to probably like 55% and just start putting in some work capacity centric volume. The nice part is our work capacity after a peaking phase is probably going to be so shit that we're not actually going to be able to take our muscles even that close to failure with that 55%. So it should constitute a deload a lot of the time anyway, but I'm rambling a little bit.
All right, this one has 7 likes.
Oh,
why did you lose more reps set to set on some lifts more than others? For example, going 10-10-9-8 versus 10-10-7-6.
That is unbelievably complicated if you really got into the nitty-gritty of everything that can contribute to that. Like there's energy systems at play. A lot of that is going to be how locally fatiguing versus holistically fatiguing a lift is. Locally fatiguing being like very fatiguing to the muscle fiber itself and like the soreness the next day, and this is local damage, right? Whereas we use this term holistic fatigue. Holistic probably is a better word than CNS fatigue. I'm sure many of you have heard CNS fatigue, and some people are, I don't know, you could say it's pedantic, some could say it's just being accurate. CNS fatigue might not be the most accurate way to describe that phenomenon. Maybe it isn't your CNS that's getting fatigued, but you guys know what I mean when you do a heavy lift and you're like, well, no one part of me feels all that fatigue, but my ability to output force, I can't jump as high, I can't overhead press as much, everything comes down, not just the output of that local area. You're more tired, you're run down, right? We got this idea of holistic fatigue, and how holistically fatiguing an exercise is pretty multifactorial, but we're looking at a couple main things. It's like, how great is the absolute tonnage? How far are we moving that absolute tonnage, right? So something like a deadlift, where we're taking a very high absolute tonnage for the strength of the lifter, we're moving it across a pretty darn big range of motion. And then the third component is how much like local fatigue there is around the spine. So like axial loading, things that tend to fatigue like your lower back, tend to contribute heavily to this holistic fatigue. Your body kind of notices, hey, our ability to stabilize our spine due to this local fatigue is down, kind of shuts everything else, our ability to output force everywhere else down a little bit maybe. So I'd say those are kind of the 3 things that come to mind. Is we'll do one more after this. The absolute tonnage being moved, the distance that load is being moved, and then how demanding it is on the spine, right? So something like a squat is probably going to be more taxing than something maybe like a belt squat, right? Where, okay, we're using maybe even more tonnage on that belt squat for a comparable range of motion, but that third component of the axial loading kind of comes in there. Whereas if we go the opposite direction, we take something that's a very low load, like a concentration curl, the range of motion is not that crazy. Maybe I could think of something with a smaller range. Maybe like a calf raise, right? So we're doing like a single leg seated calf raise. Absolute load, pretty low. Range of motion, pretty low. Axial loading, negligible. I would expect people to be able to better repeatedly duplicate their performance on something like that than something that checks the opposite boxes like a deadlift. But holy shit, there's probably so many things I did not cover in that. Those would just be a couple things that come to mind.
All right, I think we should do 2 more.
All right, you're
this
the boss.
One is popular. What is a good video or resource you'd recommend for overhead press regarding hand width form, programming, and anything related? Any chance of a SAM one if no such suitable one exists? And then people agreeing and asking about pausing your strict presses and if it's worth it. So
as far as form, Brian Alsru's got a pretty good couple of videos on the strict press. I'll just start with those. They kind of check the basics. They're pretty darn good. As far as programming, Brian Alsru has some about his approach. Alec Onkiri has a good video he put up, I want to say it was like years ago now, that he covers his approach. I would say both are very effective. There's nothing really, really comprehensive out there because it's not a competitive motion. People have put less thought into getting as absolutely good as they can, right? Hey, I'm going to give you guys a little unrelated tidbit here. Breaking a world record in a lift that isn't done in competitions is not as impressive as a contested lift. Not just because you're held to a higher standard, you have to do it on a given day and anybody can gym lift and all that stuff, but the fact that if it's a contested lift, there are more people spending more of their career and dedicating more training resources to it. It's just contested more. So no disrespect to Andrew Richards, his overhead press is sick, crazy, absolutely wild. you have to realize that back when the clean and press was an Olympic event, people were already over the 500-pound barrier. It would be higher by now if it was continued to be a contested event. So just make sure you factor in whether something's like someone breaking the deadlift record or especially the record in like the clean and jerk is very different than the Jefferson deadlift world record. Nothing against the Jefferson deadlift world record, awesome, but we have to really factor in how many people are training and how many resources are going in to beating any given task when we're appraising and comparing them between each other. Now, if we could leave that alone and just not compare lifts and say, oh, this guy's the best of this guy's the best of that, and that's fine. But if we're going to get into these conversations of, oh my God, this guy's 10% above everybody else. Well, he's 10% above other guys in their garage who are having fun with this lift. That's awesome. That's cool. That's fun. It's a ton of fun that have like a lift will become trendy and a bunch of guys will go out in the garage and see who can do the most. That's not the same as like, okay, we've got professional athletes with state funding and doping in China that are like selecting from a billion people, right? The level of impressiveness is appraised by the gene pool. What the hell what was I talking about that led me to this?
I kind of zoned out. I was reading other questions.
Overhead press. Oh yeah, because of this, there's not as many resources out there, right? The overhead press for most athletes that are competitive in something is a means to an end. Even in strongman, we don't compete in the strict press. We always have leg drive, so that's our specific movement. And the strict press is intended to be a supplemental movement to try to increase your overhead with leg drive. Now, some guys go crazy and to just have a big ego about, oh, I strict press everything. That's awesome if you're winning. If you're losing, that's no longer awesome. I could definitely make some videos talking about what I have observed to work in driving up the overhead press. I've coached a bazillion athletes over a 225 overhead press. I think I've got 3 or 4 guys who have hit a 3-plate overhead press. So I've produced some good results in it. I wouldn't say it's as in-depth as my thoughts on the bench press or the squat or the deadlift or some strongman events. But I definitely think I have as much qualification as many to give you guys my thoughts. So maybe I could do that at some point. What was the follow-up pausing. If your goal is to build a 1RM overhead press, I would pause the vast majority of your volume. I think Alec Onkiri in his video mentioned the same thing. Just the nature, it's the same thing as, okay, well, a deadlift is picked up from a dead stop. If we want to make our preparation specific, we want to pick up each rep from a dead stop, right? It's not just to make it harder. It's the fact that it's more specific to overcome a dead weight against the floor. We don't have a negative to kind of pull ourselves into a perfect position, create tension through the whole body. We have to manually create that. We have to manually pull ourselves into position. So if we do it like a touch and go set of deadlifts, while they can have their place as a developmental tool, it's not specific because only the first rep is truly specific. You could argue that even with a dead stop, it doesn't get specific after that first rep, but it's more specific. Same thing with an overhead press. First one specific, just like how we would do a single. If we're then relying on this really heavy stretch reflex, it usually leads to people hitting these awesome rep PRs. And they're like, Sam, I hit 185 for like 12 and I can't do 2 plates. Was it like, were you going like real fast through the bottom? In which case we're not practicing that motion that we're training, right? What we're going to do is a weight held here, creating force and pressing. If we do that over and over and our rep PRs are done to the same or a similar style to how we're going to do the 1RM, we would expect these improvements in rep performances to translate better. So yeah, if the goal is just general shoulder development, you don't need to pause them. If the goal is carry over to a push press, you can probably get away with not pausing them. If the goal is to maximize, to hit a big 1 rep max overhead press, you should probably pause them.
Plus, you can develop power off of the chest, which is also
true. It's just the limiting factor for most people, right? Is be able to create sufficient. Most people, if they can create enough speed to the forehead, that rep is done. Eventually, yeah, you can get away. You can get into different issues, but challenging that ability to just create force up to the forehead, very helpful for the vast majority of athletes.
You have to train tactical or functional for the rest of your life. What do you choose? Quitting or killing yourself is not an option.
The greatest shit poster in all my comments, my greatest client. He means this of the worst of both of those. He does not mean the best of functional training, and he does not mean the best of tactical training. He means the worst of it. Oh, do I do shitty tactical training where I like barrel roll around with my gun and then do like 2 sandbag picks? Or
see, the bonus of tactical is you get to carry a gun.
I could functionally carry a gun. Bad tactical training, or bad functional training? I think I'm going to do the bad functional training. I think I'm just going to like unilaterally load everything, like do squats with like a kettlebell on one side.
On a Bosu
At least I
ball.
can kind of feel like that's still strongman-ish if I'm going real heavy on shitty functional training. Bad tactical training, I'm not doing it, man. I'm not I'm not going to wear my weighted vest, baseball cap and LARP as if I was in the military.
There's also a lot of questions about bulletproofing the lower back. I think that could be a good dedicated video. So
yeah, there's a lot of them out there, right? Bulletproofing is a cool term, but it doesn't really mean anything, right? It's like, okay, well, how do we create tissue tolerance in the lower back? Well, tissue tolerance is position specific. What are you trying to bulletproof it from? If you're trying to bulletproof it to picking up stuff with a round back, well, we would probably start picking up stuff, very light stuff with a round back and increase the load. If we're trying to bulletproof our back so we don't hurt it deadlifting, well, a lot of that's just going to come down to effective deadlift programming, really. We could say, okay, well, let's look at all three or all kind of aspects of the midsection, the front, the sides, and the back. And that probably could create an environment of greater stability, which might be a good idea. We work our plank, we work our side planks, or suitcase carries, or ab rollouts. Those could have some effect, some back extensions, because a stronger lower back is going to be a bulletproof lower back. One guy said, he's like, everybody suggests these goofy, crazy back exercises. Well, back extensions and deadlifts aren't goofy and crazy, and they do a pretty good job developing lower back strength. It's just I guess I would need a more specific question. If you guys wanted a dedicated video on like this idea of bulletproofing the lower back, as much as I'm not qualified to talk on it, I'll talk on it anyway. I would need a more specific directive for like where I'm going with that video. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you participating in these. Kirsten's pointing at me.
We'll roll some over to next week because I missed some good ones.
She missed some good ones. We will roll them over to next week. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you all.